The firestorm raged across the mountain pass, flames licking the sky and turning the stars into mere flickers of light. The Galactic Empire's fleet had arrived without warning, its warships blaring a cacophony of metal screeches as they descended on the colony with brutal precision. On the ground, screams mixed with the crackling of fire as soldiers poured from their ships, weapons raised, cutting down everything in their path. Buildings crumbled, trees turned to cinder, and the air filled with the acrid scent of destruction. Through the chaos, the quiet figure of a man emerged from the smoke, his silhouette framed by the flickering glow of the inferno. Vlad Tepes, known to the world as Dracula, walked undeterred through the destruction of his homeland. His ancient eyes, bloodshot from centuries of pain, glinted with an emotion darker than the void of space itself. He moved like a shadow, swift and deadly, his senses heightened by the horrific scene before him. His home, a mansion nestled deep in the isolated mountains, had been reduced to nothing more than ruins. His heart, one stilled by years of torment, thundered in his chest as he surveyed the wreckage. His breath quickened, not from fear, but from the surge of power rising within him. Power that had lain dormant for centuries, sealed away behind a veil of sorrow. The loss of his children had awakened something far older, far more dangerous than he had ever been before. His twin sons, Alexei and Stefan, were the ones who had kept him tethered to this mortal realm. Their lives were the last reminder of the man he once was, the man who had fought for redemption. But now, they were gone. The bodies of his children were among the charred remains, their innocence extinguished in the most grotesque manner imaginable. He had not been there to protect them, and in that moment, Dracula knew that nothing mattered more than making those responsible pay. A figure in imperial armor approached, rifle raised. His finger tightened on the trigger, but before the shot could ring out, Dracula's hand shot forward, grasping the man's throat. The soldier's body convulsed in an attempt to scream, but no sound escaped as Dracula squeezed tighter, crushing his windpipe with ease. The man's eyes bulged as life drained from him, and when Dracula let him fall, his body crumpled to the ground like a lifeless doll. The air was thick with a metallic scent of blood, but Dracula didn't flinch. His mind was elsewhere, on the Empire's leader, General Kael Vos. It was Vos who had ordered this destruction. Vos, who had seen fit to slaughter innocents to draw him out. Vos, who had learned just how much of a mistake that had been. Dracula's thoughts shifted briefly to his time in exile. He had lived quietly, hidden from the world, distant from the affairs of mortals. But those days were over. The man who had once been Vlad Tepes had died with the last of his family. Now, only Dracula remained, a being of power, darkness, and unrelenting vengeance. The storm overhead seemed to reflect his fury, thunder rumbling as if the heavens themselves were in turmoil. The ground trembled beneath him as he marched toward the heart of the Empire's invasion force, each step heavier than the last. He would not be content with mere retribution. No! The Empire had made a grave mistake, a mistake they would regret until the very end. In the smoldering ruins of the colony, Dracula found the remains of his mansion. What had once been a place of refuge and love was now little more than charred beams and twisted metal. His fingers brushed against the remnants of a shattered portrait of his sons, Alexei's mischievous smile, Stefan's solemn gaze. They were gone, their lives snuffed out like flickering candles in the wind. But their deaths would not be in vain. Turning away from the wreckage, Dracula's eyes locked onto the distant horizon, where the glow of the Empire's flagship, the Aegis Eternal, hung like a malevolent moon. It was the heart of the invasion, the command center from which the destruction of his people had been orchestrated. General Vos was there, safe behind the walls of his ship, confident that he had crushed the last remnants of resistance. Dracula would show him the true cost of underestimating his wrath. He moved swiftly, his body blending into the shadows, becoming one with the night. The Empire's soldiers, focused on looting the wreckage and rounding up the survivors, were unaware of the nightmare lurking just beyond their sight. One by one, Dracula picked them off, his movements so quick and precise that by the time they realized what was happening, their lives had already been claimed. There was no sound but the whoosh of his movements, no trace left but the cold corpses that littered the ground. It didn't take long for Dracula to reach the outskirts of the Imperial camp. There, hidden beneath a veil of darkness, he summoned the remnants of his old kin, the vampires who had once fought beside him in the wars of old. There was Lucian, a master tactician, whose sharp mind had saved them in countless battles, and Gregor, a massive warrior whose fury in combat had turned the tide on many occasions. These were the only companions Dracula trusted now, men who had shared in his torment, his exile, and his unending thirst for revenge. Lucian, as always, was the first to speak, his voice low and steady. "You're certain, then? We strike tonight." Dracula's eyes, red with fury, flicked to him. "Tonight we end this." Gregor, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the camp, grinned darkly. "I've missed this. The taste of blood. The thrill of the hunt." Lucian narrowed his eyes. "This is not about the thrill. We're here for justice." Dracula nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon where the Aegis Eternal floated, like a monolithic fortress. "Justice? No, Lucian. This is about something far greater." His voice dropped to a whisper. "This is about making them fear the very mention of my name." With that, the trio set out toward the Imperial base, their movements swift and deliberate. They knew that the moment they crossed into the heart of enemy territory, there would be no turning back. The Empire would never know what hit it. In the distance, the Aegis Eternal hovered, a symbol of the Empire's unchecked power, its immense hull gleaming under the moonlight. It was a weapon of war, a floating city brimming with soldiers, technology, and the command center of General Vos. Inside, the general would be waiting, unaware that his empire was about to be torn apart. Dracula's heart thudded in his chest, the ancient rhythms of his vampiric nature rising to the surface. His thirst for vengeance had become something far more profound, something that transcended the mere killing of his enemies. His sons had been stolen from him, his family obliterated, and now, the only thing left in his heart was the raw, undeniable need to make the Empire pay. He felt the weight of his centuries-old curse settle upon him once again, a curse that had once seemed like a shackle, but now felt like a weapon with the power to strike down entire worlds. As they drew closer to the Imperial stronghold, the moon dipped behind a thick veil of clouds, plunging the world into darkness. And in that darkness, Dracula felt a surge of energy, an ancient power awakening in him once more. This was no longer about simply striking back. This was about proving that even in the face of an empire that spanned galaxies, there was one force that would never bow, and that force was Dracula. In the distance, the first sign of movement appeared, an Imperial guard, patrolling the outer perimeter. With the swiftness of a shadow, Dracula and his companions moved forward, their path illuminated only by the faint glow of distant stars. As the guard passed within range, Dracula's hand shot out, gripping the soldier's throat before the man could even react. The sound of the soldier's breath, choking off, was drowned by the night. This was only the beginning. The silent void of space stretched endlessly around the Aegis Eternal, its massive hull looming against the backdrop of a starry expanse. Within the command deck, General Kael Vos stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out into the vastness. The Empire's might was concentrated within this colossal ship, a symbol of power and control. Yet, a shadow lingered over Vos's thoughts, one he could not shake. His victory over Dracula had seemed certain. The attacks on the vampire's colony had been decisive, swift, and merciless. But even as his men celebrated the annihilation of the supposed last of the immortals, Vos felt an unsettling ripple, an unknown danger lurking in the depths of his mind. Something was stirring, something ancient. Vos turned abruptly, his gaze narrowing. Is everything prepared for the next phase of the operation? A lieutenant, pale from fatigue, looked up from a console. Yes, General. The ground forces are on standby. We've already begun the sweep of the outer colonies. No sign of resistance, yet Voss's expression remained unchanged, but there was a flicker of unease in his cold, calculating eyes. Dracula's death should have ended the problem, but the vampire's legacy, dark and ancient, still felt like a curse upon him. The Emperor had made it clear that no one, no matter how powerful, was to challenge the Empire's dominance. Yet Dracula was not just anyone. The doors to the command deck slid open, and a man in a black suit entered. His face was sharp, chiseled, his movements smooth as if he glided through the air rather than walked. Lucian, once Dracula's most trusted lieutenant, now an enemy agent working directly with Vos. "I trust you're pleased with the progress, General," Lucian said, his voice a low murmur as he crossed the room. "Please?" Vos snapped, his lips curling into a thin smile. "Let's not pretend this is over. Dracula is no ordinary adversary. His bloodline, his resilience, it's beyond anything we've faced." Lucian's eyes gleamed with something darker, something that went beyond mere ambition. "You underestimate him, General. He is far from gone." Voss's gaze hardened, his fingers twitching as though he were about to reach for something deadly. "I've had enough of your cryptic warnings. Tell me plainly, Lucian. Do you still harbor loyalty to Dracula?" Lucian's lips curled into a barely perceptible smile. "Loyalty, General, is a dangerous thing, and it is a mistake to believe that only one force controls the shadows. Dracula's reign has ended, but what's left in his wake is far more dangerous." Voss's hand clenched into a fist, the weight of his words sinking in. Lucian was right. There was something darker, more primal, now that Dracula's hold had broken. But Vos was a general, a man who had built his empire with calculated precision, not superstition. "I will deal with Dracula's remnants as I've dealt with all threats," Vos said coldly. "And once this is done, I'll see to your reward for your cooperation." Lucian's smile deepened. "Be careful, General. Sometimes the reward is not what it seems." Before Vos could respond, a sudden, sharp beeping echoed through the room, an alarm blaring across the ship. A deep tremor shook the command deck, and Voss's hand flew to the nearest console. The screens displayed a massive disturbance. Hundreds of small, glowing blips had appeared on the radar, moving at incredible speeds toward the Aegis Eternal. "What is this?" Vos growled, his mind racing. Lucian's eyes narrowed. "That, General, is a beginning." In an instant, the command deck was thrown into chaos. The lights flickered, and the rumble of something unseen shook the ship to its core. The crew scrambled to their stations as the blips on the radar grew larger and more numerous. Outside, the silhouette of Dracula's forces was becoming clear. Dracula was no longer merely a figure of myth. He had returned, and this time he was not alone. Dracula stood at the heart of his camp, surrounded by the remnants of his old allies. His fury was palpable, the scent of death heavy in the air as his plans took shape. The Aegis Eternal loomed on the horizon, its presence like a dark moon casting its shadow across the land. Dracula had waited long enough. "Lucian may have betrayed me," Dracula muttered, his voice laced with venom. "But he forgets that I am not so easily erased." At his side stood Gregor, his massive form towering over the group, his face a grim mask of determination. Lucian had been his comrade once, but betrayal was an unforgivable sin. "Vos will pay for what he's done," Gregor said, his voice low but filled with righteous anger. "I've fought too long for this." Dracula's sharp eyes studied the night sky as the first wave of his forces prepared to take action. Vampires, once allies, now stood with him as his final strike against the Empire. Their faces were grim, but there was something else in their eyes: fear. They knew the consequences of failing Dracula, and the Vampire King's wrath was far worse than any death they could imagine. "Tonight, we become the nightmare they never saw coming," Dracula said softly, a cold smirk spreading across his face. "Let them think their victory is complete. Let them bask in the false security that they have won. When the time comes, they will know how much I can endure. At the front of the group, Lucian's eyes gleamed with anticipation, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The Aegis Eternal is more than just a ship, it's a fortress. We cannot assault it head-on. Dracula's gaze shifted to Lucian, his expression unreadable. And so, do you think we will sit idly by and let them mock us? Lucian's lips quirked upward. Not mock you, my lord, but we must be clever. We strike when they least expect it, in the heart of their power. Dracula remained silent for a moment, his sharp mind working quickly. Then we strike through their own shadows. Their soldiers may be powerful, but they are mere men. They will never anticipate our strategy. As the plan began to unfold, Dracula's forces moved with deadly intent. Under the cover of darkness, they infiltrated the Empire's stronghold. Every step taken, every move made, was calculated. Each vampire, each warrior, moved with the precision of an apex predator. And as they neared the Aegis Eternal, Dracula could feel the pulse of the ship, its vast presence, its hum of power, and the fragile arrogance of its crew. Lucian, still at the helm of the mission, glanced back at Dracula with a knowing look. This will be your reckoning, General Vos, and it will not be one you survive. Vos, back on the ship, stood frozen in disbelief. The disturbance was growing stronger by the second. The blips on the radar were now no longer just small dots. They were massive, and they were moving with a calculated speed toward the Aegis Eternal. His worst fears were coming to life. They're here, Vos muttered, his voice laced with disbelief. How could he have gotten so close? His mind raced, scrambling for a solution, but his orders were clear. He would not allow Dracula to have the last laugh. This was his empire, his war, his victory. But even as he braced himself for the impending battle, he knew the truth. Dracula's return had set something in motion, a chain of events that could no longer be stopped. The descent had begun, and Vos, for all his ambition, might not survive the fall. The first explosion rocked the Aegis Eternal, sending shockwaves through the corridors of the ship. A cry for help echoed in the distance, but it was drowned out by the next blast. The war had begun, and there would be no turning back. The Aegis Eternal was now a shell of its former self. Smoke billowed from the ship's fractured hull, and the once pristine corridors were now a twisted labyrinth of ruin. The lights flickered intermittently, casting the ship in a sickly, strobing glow. General Kael Vos stood alone in the command deck, his uniform torn, face bloodied, but his eyes burning with a cold fury. The war had escalated beyond his control, and his forces, once so sure of victory, were crumbling under the relentless onslaught of Dracula's followers. Vos clenched his fists, his knuckles cracking with the force. The betrayals, the failures, each cut deeper than the last. Lucian's smirk still haunted him. We strike when they least expect it. The words echoed in his mind. A final taunt from the man who had once fought at his side, only to turn and bring chaos to his doorstep. The lieutenants were dead, fallen in the early waves of the attack. Their blood stained the ship's walls, a reminder of the Empire's dwindling power. He was alone, his only allies the cold walls of the ship and the dwindling remnants of his crew, desperate and disorganized. But he would not fall so easily. Vos had led armies, crushed civilizations, and built empires from the ground up. He would not let one man, one vampire, bring it all down. His hand gripped the cold console before him as he activated the communication array. He would need reinforcements, and he would need them now. General Vos, a voice crackled over the comms, strained but alive. It was Lieutenant Corwin, one of the few who had survived the initial onslaught. We've lost the outer ring. The vampires are everywhere. We need to. The transmission cut off abruptly, and Vos slammed his fist into the console. The sound of distant explosions reverberated through the ship, a grim reminder that the battle was far from over. He needed a way out, some way to turn the tide before it was too late. But in the back of his mind, he knew the truth. There was no escape. This was the final stand. Suddenly, the loud screech of metal echoed through the deck as a section of the ship's bulkhead caved in. Vos turned in time to see the hulking figure of Gregor storming through the smoke and debris. His armor was scorched, his eyes gleaming with a feral intensity. In his massive hands, he wielded a jagged, blood-stained sword, a weapon crafted for one purpose: destruction. "You've run out of time, General," Gregor growled, his voice like thunder. "The Empire dies with you." His words, dark and cold, hung in the air like a death sentence. Vos's pulse quickened, but he remained composed. "I've faced worse than you, Gregor, and I've won." His hand reached for the weapon at his side, a pulse rifle, its barrel sleek and menacing. But as he raised it, his eyes flicked to the control panel behind Gregor. The countdown for the ship's self-destruction had already begun. The Aegis Eternal was on a one-way collision course with Oblivion, and no matter the outcome, they were both headed toward the same fate. "You think you can win this?" Gregor sneered. "You're already dead, General. Your empire is gone. I am your reckoning." Vos stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I will not let you end this. Not like this." With a roar, Gregor charged, the sound of his heavy steps echoing through the deck. Vos fired. The blast rang out, but Gregor's massive form absorbed the impact, his thick armor deflecting the shot. In an instant, he was upon Vos, swinging his sword in a deadly arc. Vos barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as the blade whistled past his face. The force of the swing knocked him back, but he regained his footing in time to roll to the side and fire again. This time, the shot struck Gregor's exposed arm, sending him stumbling back with a grunt of pain. But Gregor wasn't finished. He bellowed in fury and hurled his sword at Vos with incredible speed. Vos sidestepped, just narrowly avoiding the deadly projectile. The sword embedded itself in the wall behind him, leaving a gaping hole in the metal. Vos didn't hesitate. He reached for a grenade at his belt, his fingers nimble despite the pain searing through his body. He pulled the pin and tossed it toward Gregor. The explosion shook the entire deck, sending shockwaves through the ship's core. Vos was thrown back, slamming into a wall as fire engulfed the space around him. When the smoke cleared, Gregor was still standing, bloody but unbowed. Vos, his breathing ragged, staggered to his feet, knowing he could not afford another confrontation like that. The grenade had done some damage, but not enough. Not nearly enough. "You're strong," Gregor muttered, his voice filled with a dark amusement. "But not strong enough." Before Vos could respond, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A deep rumble echoed throughout the ship. Vos's eyes widened as realization hit him. The countdown was accelerating. There was no more time. This fight, their war, it would all end in the void of space. But Vos wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. "You may have taken my crew," Vos growled, his voice low and full of rage. "But you have not taken my will." With renewed determination, he lunged at Gregor, tackling him to the ground. The two men wrestled, their bodies colliding with a bone-jarring force. Vos struck first, landing a brutal punch to Gregor's jaw, followed by another to his throat. Gregor, gasping for air, retaliated with a knee to Vos's stomach, sending him crashing into the deck. Vos's vision blurred from the impact, but he didn't stop. He couldn't, through sheer force of will. He stood and grabbed a discarded energy blade from the floor. The weapon hummed to life in his hand, its edge glowing with lethal intent. Vos's eyes locked onto Gregor, and for a moment, it was as if time itself had frozen. He could see the man, no, the monster, before him, the embodiment of everything that had led them here. The betrayal, the destruction, the endless cycle of war. And in that instant, Vos knew what he had to do. He moved faster than Gregor could react, slicing the energy blade across the vampire's chest. The sharp, crackling sound of energy cutting through flesh rang out. Gregor stumbled back, shock and pain spreading across his face. But before he could retaliate, Vos lunged again, his blade aimed for Gregor's heart. The vampire's eyes widened as the blade pierced his chest. Gregor's body went limp, and for a moment, Vos was certain he had won. But as Gregor crumpled to the floor, his final words echoed in Vos's mind. "You will never win. The darkness will always come for you." The ship's alarm continued to blare, the countdown nearing its end. Vos, bloodied and battered, looked down at the fallen warrior. His heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had ended the fight, but the war was far from over. The Aegis Eternal was dying, and so was everything it represented. But there was still a chance. The self-destruct sequence had been initiated, but Vos was not one to go down without a fight. He stumbled to the console, fingers trembling as he frantically punched in commands. The ship's systems responded, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might succeed. Then the voice of Lucian crackled through the comms, cold and filled with finality. "You cannot stop it, General. The Empire dies with you. It is already too late." Vos's eyes narrowed, but a bitter smile tugged at his lips. Lucian had underestimated him. He had underestimated the will of a man who would rather burn everything than let it fall into the hands of traitors. With one final, decisive move, Vos sent the ship's final command, a self-destruct countdown, faster and more destructive than ever before. The Aegis Eternal was no more. As the ship's final moments played out, Vos's vision blurred. He felt the weight of everything that had led him to this moment. The lives lost, the betrayals, the wars fought, and in his final breath, he knew one thing with certainty. Redemption would never come. Not for him, not for his empire. The Requiem had begun, and the price of victory was paid in blood.